Welcome to Criminal Justice in a Nutshell. My name is Dr. John Fisher, and today's episode of Criminal Justice in a Nutshell is race and the death penalty. The death penalty has been a toxic, very controversial subject for centuries. Well, since 1791 or so. The death penalty has been accused of, or capital punishment in the United States in the way that it's administered, has been accused of, and the court has even agreed in Furman versus Georgia, that the death penalty is a racist institution because of the way that it was practiced. Prior to 1967, prior to 1967, the death penalty, as it was administered, showed that 90% of all defendants sentenced to die for the crime of rape were African American. And this was an avenue. This is an avenue, and some say, and there's a contention, that the death penalty is the last grasp of white supremacy within this country. Because juries are sentencing African American defendants to death more often than any other race, group, or creed within the country. So, what is discrimination? Or discrimination involves the questions of whether discretion permits the death penalty to be deliberately directed disproportionately against certain qualified defendants, not because of their crimes, but because they belong to a particular class or group. And discrimination is a deliberate action to where people are using the death penalty as a way to seek revenge, retaliation, or just to kill the African American population because of some form of bias or hate. Okay, discrimination versus disparity. Disparity refers to the numerical differences based on characteristics such as race. Okay, there has been a historical pattern of racial disparity in the imposition of the death penalty in the United States, and that goes without question. The penalty has been imposed on blacks disproportionately to their numbers in the general population. About 54% of the people on death row are African American, whereas the African American population only makes up 12% of the general population. So, yes, there's a disproportionate, and the numbers and the facts show that there's a disproportionate number of African Americans being sentenced to death. If we wanted, and I've mentioned it a couple other times, abortion is also a way that we're killing the African American population. There's a website called blackgenocide.org, and it's about how the African American population numbers are being kept at 12% through the use and the advantage of abortion, and focusing abortion clinics like Planned Parenthood into the African American population so that they do not have an opportunity to grow their numbers. That doesn't change the fact that more people from the African American community are being sentenced to die and proportionate to the rest of the population. There's nothing inherently wrong with disparities if they're justified by relevant legal factors. One such legal factor is that 95% of all crime occurs in the inner city. The African American population make a vast majority of the residents in the population within the inner city, so it can be understandable that more African Americans are going to be sentenced to death than other races because of the statistical fact that more crime occurs in the inner city. Discrimination is a violation of equal protection under the 14th Amendment. Okay, your race should not be a determining factor in your sentence that is given by the court system. Also, it's a violation of the special restrictions on the use of capital punishment under the Eighth Amendment. Those receiving, or those who are sentenced to die, must receive super due process. There's extra rules that have to be followed, and we've covered those in the past weeks. In order for somebody to prove that discrimination, well, let me back up. You have to prove that discrimination cannot use aggregate patterns. Proving discrimination on specific cases is very difficult because you have to individually try each juror. And one of the videos that I showed, that I shared in the week plan, or below this one, in the course module, is about a defendant in the state of Texas who was sentenced to die just because he was black. They said that he was more dangerous than other people just because he was an African American. I don't know the results of that case. You guys have that requirement to address that in the course week. But it's very hard to prove the discrimination in specific cases. Social class, the people that we find receiving the death penalty more often than not are those of the lower social classes, men over women, young over old, and then the race of the offender and the race of the victim. You're more likely to receive the death penalty if your victim was white. So some of the theories is that black defendants and victims are discriminated against because blacks are feared, disliked, and or both. There is a racial hatred towards the African American population, and because of this, they are sentenced to die more often than others. There's an unconscious psychological process of racial identification, institutional racism, and the death penalty serves as other latent purposes, which the graduate students in this class are also going to address. There is a claim that the death penalty is the last vestiges of white supremacy in this country. It is a way for the white population to control and maintain control over the behaviors and the activities of the African American population. In other words, if the whites don't like what you're doing, they're going to execute you. And we saw the lynchings when mob violence was extremely detrimental. From the 1880s to the 1930s, we saw a severe to 90% decrease in public lynchings. And this was because the African American population, the white population, were able to use the courts to execute African Americans that they didn't like and or committed a behavior that they disapproved of. So, because of this, public lynchings went down because now we had public state-sanctioned lynchings through the issues of through the courts and the death penalty. The Jacksboro Boys was one of the greatest, not greatest, one of the most influential evidences, excuse me, I'm sorry, of mob violence and the mob pushing and forcing the death penalty on people. These 5 guys at Jacksboro, the Jacksboro Boys, were convicted of murdering a hobo on a train. The mob showed up. The mob demanded justice, and the justice that they demanded was the death penalty. And as a way to appease the mob, the jury didn't care what the actual facts of the case were. They sentenced these 5 young men to die, and then they died. And one of the problems with the death penalty is that sentence is irrevocable. Once we've executed you, we can't fix it. You're dead, and you're going to stay dead. We can't fix that. So super due process is required because of the irrevocability of the death penalty, and it's needed to ensure that And it's needed to ensure that people are being executed because of the crimes they committed, not because of their race or religion or gender orientation or any of those things. So it's extremely important that we, as a community, as a society, use super due process to make sure that we're not punishing somebody just because of the race of their skin. I'm looking forward to a great week. This has been Dr. John Fisher, Criminal Justice in a Nutshell, Race and the Death Penalty. It's a brief nutshell lecture. We could spend an entire semester talking about racism and the death penalty, but we're going to restrict it to 1 week, so you only get 11 minutes. I hope you have a very good day, and don't forget to get your assignments turned in, and don't forget we always write using APA 6th edition.